Okay, so today we're going to start chapter 16, which is the Civil War. But the first real battle of the Civil War isn't going to happen today, even though you might want to consider it a battle. It's really not a battle, and I'll explain why in just a minute. They call it the Battle of Fort Sumter, but come on now, let's be real. If the casualty figures only meet a certain quantity of people killed and wounded, then we probably don't call it a battle. We call it a skirmish or a fight. But, okay, so we'll get to that. I guess one of the things that people always struggle with when we talk about war is the difference between a battle and a war. Can anybody describe to me, it's super stupid simple, the difference between battle and war? Yeah. Okay, so he says a war is over years and a battle is days or weeks. So it has something to do with length of time. Is that agreeable to everyone? Does anybody want to add to that or alter that? It's not a bad description. Could a war be faster than years? Yeah, it could be. How many people are fighting in it? So a battle would be smaller than a war? Okay. Does, Big Mike says two different countries. Does it have to be two different countries? Well, kind of, but in the instance of the Civil War, they sort of consider themselves a separate country, but are they? Every person that's killed in the Civil War is going to be an American. So here's the reason why people get confused with this, and I'll see it on essay answers when we're talking about the Battle of Gettysburg or something. I ask you to answer a question. And some people will put the War of Gettysburg. Okay, here's the difference between the two. A battle is a part of a war. So it takes a bunch of battles to make up a war. So the analogy is like a battle is sort of like a chapter inside a book, which is the war. Does that make sense? So when we talk about the Civil War, there's a whole boatload of battles that are going to take place throughout the 4 or 5 years time period that the Civil War is going to encompass. In other wars, it might be less than a year. In other wars, it might be a battle makes up a war. But that's kind of something that we have to address. So we're just going to look in chapter 16 at the first 2 years, 1861 and 1862. And that'll set the stage for how things are going to look. So there's a lot of things we're going to have to deal with. And first, before we even get started with that, I want you to think about how difficult it must have been for Abraham Lincoln to step in as the president at a time when the country is ripped in half. So when Abraham Lincoln steps in as president, I would say that of all of these men along the top of the wall, and I still don't have a President Biden one yet, I'll work on that someday when I have time, or one of you make me one, I don't care. Anyway, of all of these men, I would say probably Abraham Lincoln steps into the biggest poop sandwich of all of the presidents. His country's tore apart. Besides that, we know that he's got some personal issues dealing with a wife that's got a little bit of cuckoo in her. And besides that, he's got a son, Robert, who refuses to listen to him. Robert's like, Dad, I'm going into the army. And his dad is like, no, you're not, son. It's too dangerous. I don't want you to die. And Robert's like, Dad, I'm going into the army. And he does. So he's got a son that's fighting in this war. He's got a wife that needs him and he's not there for her. He's got a country that's tore apart, or at least threatening to tear itself apart. So the election takes place in November of 1860. By December 20th of 1860, some of the southern states, including South Carolina, decide to secede. He's not even president yet. So you're not president because of the election that takes place in November. You don't become president until you're, what's the word? Thank you. Very good. Inaugurated. So that back then would have been March. So Abraham Lincoln's sitting back watching the country kind of melting away in front of him, and he has no power or authority to do anything about it. And the lame duck president that's leaving, James Buchanan, he doesn't really do anything about it because he's a lame duck. So Lincoln is just sitting back watching this happen, and he has no ability to stop it. the South Carolinians say a geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all states north of that line have united in the election of a man in the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. What does hostile mean? Kind of mean to, against, an affront to. So they're saying, you guys in the North have elected a guy that's against slavery. Well, here's the reality of this deal. Abraham Lincoln did not like slavery. That's clear. Everybody understood that. But Lincoln was very clear when he was running for president that his number one most important goal was not to get rid of slavery. His number one most important goal was to keep the family together, keep the Union united. So he's making promises. Before he's even elected, he's telling South Carolina and Virginia and North Carolina and all of the southern states that will eventually become Confederate, he's telling them, guys, if you don't leave, I won't touch slavery, I promise. Now we have to assume that when Abraham Lincoln makes a promise, he's a pretty high character guy, that he's probably going to stick to his word. And I guess it's easy for us to look back at history and say Abraham Lincoln was a pretty high character person, but maybe they didn't know him that well in 1860. And South Carolina, you're fine. South Carolina didn't trust him. So the Southerners feel like they have no choice but to leave because they believe that he's against them, that he's going to end slavery. He's begging them, don't leave, I promise, we won't mess with slavery. And they just can't believe him. They don't think it's going to happen. So the slaveholding states will no longer have the power of self-government or self-protection. And the federal government will have become their enemy. Well, this is just wrong because the Supreme Court of the United States, especially in the Dred Scott case, had already determined that the Constitution and the Fifth Amendment protects our right to our property. And blacks are just property. So the Supreme Court had already decided. The federal government, one of the branches of the federal government, had already said, slaves aren't people, they're not citizens. Can't take them away. Throw in on top of that, the 10th Amendment in the Constitution is states' rights, which means each state really ultimately has the authority to create its own laws. So if South Carolina wants to have slaves, well, the Fifth Amendment says we can't take them away, and the 10th Amendment says South Carolina can have slaves. So if that's the case and the Constitution is clear that slavery can't exist, and it's been determined by the Supreme Court that slavery can't exist, what's the only way to get rid of slavery?
A war.
If the Constitution says we can't do something and we really want to do something, what's the only way we can do that something? Right? She says, vote on it. You're really close. Okay, let me give you another example, and this one will become clearer later, but we've talked about this briefly. If we want to make alcohol illegal in the United States, what do we have to do to the Constitution?
Change it.
What's it called when we change the Constitution? The word that means a formal change to a document or a change to a formal document. There are 27 of them in the Constitution. Crickets.
I know the word.
Starts with an A. How's that help? An amendment. The only way to change the Constitution and take away the right of people to own slaves would be to amend the Constitution. Let's think about it this way. See what you think about this. If South Carolina, who is definitely in favor of slavery, leaves the country and takes with it most of the other states that are in favor of slavery, it takes 3/4 of the states to approve an amendment to the Constitution. Once those southern states leave, what happens to Abraham Lincoln's ability, if he chooses to change the Constitution or amend the Constitution? If the slave states all leave, that leaves only free states. How hard is it to get the free states to agree to what ultimately will be the 13th Amendment? It's not. So by leaving, those southern states actually made it easier for Abraham Lincoln to ultimately, eventually, abolish slavery. But that wasn't his original goal and his original intention. Now, maybe those southern states believed that there was no way they were going to lose, and we're going to talk more about that in just a minute when the fighting starts. So the federal government wasn't their enemy. Just like when I look around the class around election time, there were some of you that were kind of in panic mode. There are some Donald Trump supporters in here, and there are Donald Trump supporters across the country. And I'm not saying which side I agree with or believe with, but I do remember telling you around election time, don't panic. The country can't fall apart because we've elected someone maybe that you don't support. There's some Joe Biden people in here that are pretty happy about that. Has the country fallen apart with Biden as president for about 2 months? Not quite 2 months, a little over a month. No. In fact, can you really tell a difference? There's only one thing that's really changed in the last month and a half, at least in our everyday lives, and that's the price of gas. Part of that might be as a result of a new president, but yeah, guys, all the oil wells in Texas froze up because of that coldness. And we're at a time of year when the oil prices almost always go up. We're likely going to see another spike in oil prices. Some of that might be as a result of the change in the presidency, but the reality of it is, don't panic. One man can't ruin the country. He's not going to take away all of our rights because we've got those other branches and we've got the power of the states. If Nebraska wants to, we can set the speed limit at 120 miles an hour.
Willow's car doesn't even go that fast.
Yeah, I don't think my minivan will go that fast either. Or if we want to, we can set the speed limit at 40. That way we're safer when Marcus gets a driver's license.
No, when Amy gets a driver's license.
Oh my gosh, Amy with a driver's license.
She gets a driver's license
Oh,
on Monday
boy.
if she passes.
Make sure when Amy gets her driver's license to stay off the sidewalk. Get it? Because you drive on the sidewalk. And give it to little children. For those of you listening to the video, Amy said she's going to have candy in her car to give the little children on the side of the road. Here, little child, would you like to get a ride? And here's some candy. That's weird. But
I thought there was like.
if the federal government doesn't want Nebraska to set the speed limit at 120, then they have to pass a constitutional amendment saying the maximum speed limit is 80 or 75 or whatever we choose to set it at. But they have to add a constitutional amendment, which is really, really hard to do. So here's the thing. We're going to start some fighting. And one of the issues that we're going to have, once those Confederate states create their own country, when they break away and form their own nation, the Confederate States of America, they have to form an army because they know they're going to have to defend themselves from the Union. Abraham Lincoln knows that as soon as he takes office, he's going to have to somehow force those Confederate states back into the Union. This is going to be a difficult thing to do. But when we talk about the Confederate states forming an army, here's the thing. They're going to get their army from America's army. When we talk about the makeup of the United States Army at the time of 1860, at the outbreak of the Civil War, the fighting starting in 1861, probably about half of the United States Army was made up of young Southerners. So when the war breaks out, those young Southerners have got a decision to make. Is their loyalty with the United States or is their loyalty with home? What do you think most of them do? Home. So there are two major military academies in the United States at this time. One of them is called Virginia Military Institute, VMI. Anybody want to guess where it's located? Virginia, yeah. Okay. Most of the cadets at VMI were young Southern gentlemen. So planters would send their children off to become officers. If you go to a military academy, when you graduate from the military academy, you're an officer. Officer means you get to boss people around. If you go join the Army right out of high school, you're going to enlist and you're going to be the lowest of the low. And you're going to get bossed around. And then if you stay in the Army for a while and you do good things, you move up in rank. And maybe someday eventually you can become an officer. If you go to college for the military, you're automatically an officer. So you don't start at the bottom, you start at the bottom of the middle. You have people under. You make more money. You get to boss people around. If the statistical chances are that someone in this class is going to be military at some point. Let's say you decide you want to go to college. If you go to college, not most, colleges have something called ROTC. It stands for Reserve Officer Training Corps. If you go to college and you join the ROTC, they teach you some stuff about being a soldier, and they teach you some classes about leadership. And then when you finish college, you might just have a degree in animal puppetry. I don't know what kind of college degree you get, but whatever your degree is in, you're automatically an officer in the military. And they'll pay for your college too. So there's kind of some sweet little tricks to that. So those are things you might think about if you're considering the military as a career. By the way, military isn't a bad career. Career meaning like that's your life. And maybe some of you know people that have had a military career. Here's the thing. If you serve in the military for 20 years, which seems like forever when you're only 14 or 13 or 15 or however old you are, 20 years you can retire and collect your military pension. Now the Army and the Navy and the Air Force and the Marines and Coast Guard and Space Force, they don't pay really well, but you get pretty good benefits from it, like health care for the rest of your life and so on. 20 years. Well, if you join at 18, 20 years of service puts you at 38. You're really too young to retire, so what do most retired military do? They get another job. Maybe they go to college, or maybe they have college, because if you've been in the military for 20 years, you can do college while you're in the military. But they start another career. So maybe they become a teacher and they teach for 25 years and then they retire and they're still only 60 something, and they collect a pension from the military and they collect money from what their real job was, their other career was. You get it that that's a pretty good gig. Or maybe you're just a good saver. You marry someone that makes a lot of money and you retire at 38 and go play golf every day. Or if you're Big Mike, you do Wii boxing every day all by yourself. Sometimes he does Wii tennis. It's a good backhand. Wii tennis is kind of hard. I don't know. Anyway, so here's the other kick in the pants. Even at the other military academy, West Point, which is located in New York, the vast majority of the cadets at West Point, or not the vast majority, more than half are Southerners. The real kick in the pants with all of this is that both military academies, the bulk of the teachers or instructors were Southerners. So when the war really gets a kick in, one of the biggest themes that we're going to talk about is a lack of leadership for the Union. If the instructors at the military academies are all Southerners, that means they're going to have better generals. That's going to be an issue for us. So here's what happens. The commander of American troops in a southern fort, it's called Fort Sumter, it protects Charleston Harbor, was an officer, a Union officer named Colonel Robert Anderson. So he's actually located, Charleston Harbor, by the way, is one of the most important harbors in the South. It slaps Abraham Lincoln in the face immediately upon being elected, being inaugurated. He's inaugurated in March of 1861, either March 4th or March 5th. So like today in 1861, Lincoln takes office. Shortly after that, he gets a communication from Colonel Anderson, located in Fort Moultrie. It says Fort Sumter. I'll come back to that in just a minute. In Charleston Harbor, Robert Anderson says, President Lincoln, this is serious. We need reinforcements and we need supplies. We can't hold out much longer. Fort Moultrie is surrounded by Confederate troops. So Lincoln has a tough decision. If he sends supplies and reinforcements to Fort Moultrie or Fort Sumter later on, that's going to be seen as an act of war against the Confederacy. It's going to start. If he doesn't send supplies and reinforcements and he abandons Robert Anderson and is about 85 men, what do you think that does to the prospects of building a stronger army later if you've just demonstrated that you're going to abandon your men out in the field? You want to fight for a president that doesn't have your back? So Abraham Lincoln's like, you're darned if you do, darned if you don't. If you send the supplies, you might start a war. If you don't send the supplies and there's a war later, you look like a real jackwagon. What decision do you suppose he makes? Sends the supplies. They don't get there. So here's what happens. He sends a ship called the Star of the West. There's no troops on the ship, so he's expecting that the Confederates will allow it through because it's just full of supplies like Mountain Dew and Red Bull and Pop-Tarts and stuff that soldiers need for. I'm just kidding, Riley. They really didn't have Red Bull. Just Mountain Dew and Pop-Tarts. So it's full of all the supplies that they need. The Star of the West gets to Charleston. It's like right there. And it kind of turns the corner into Charleston Harbor. And boom, 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 boom. They start shelling it with artillery shells. And the Star of the West is like, and it turns around and goes home. At about the same time, Robert Anderson figures out that Fort Moultrie is a bad place to keep his men because it's on the coast. It's on shore. So it's easily surrounded by Confederate troops. So he moves his men into a newer fort called Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is in the middle of Charleston Harbor. By the way, has anybody ever been to Charleston, South Carolina? I love it there. Have you been to Fort Sumter?
No.
You said you're going there?
No, I went last summer.
You didn't go to Fort Sumter, though. Charleston is maybe one of my favorite cities in America. The people there are super chill. The restaurants are cool. There's lots of live music. There's lots of really cool museums. There's neat architecture. There's lots of history. There's an aircraft carrier there that you can visit and go on a tour of. It's a World War II aircraft carrier. I think it's the USS Lexington. Not 100% sure which carrier it is. It's been a while since I've been there. But they go to the middle of the harbor. Fort Sumter was supposed to be built right after the American Revolution to protect Charleston. But it's, 70 years later, 80 years later, after it was commissioned to be built, what they did is they built it for a while and then the government would run out of money, so they stopped building it, and then a few years later they'd have some more money, so they'd be like, let's work on Fort Sumter. So even by the time Robert Anderson is in Fort Sumter in 1861, it's not done. It's like, what? So, but he goes there because it's safer than Fort Moultrie. The Confederates attack before supplies arrive. On April 12, 1861, the Confederates opened fire 34 hours of shelling, nonstop bombardment. And I'll show you a map in just a minute that'll show you where the shelling is coming from. Fort Sumter is not necessarily safe. The Confederates have 4,003 guns and mortars pointed directly at Fort Sumter. So over that 34-hour period, I believe the number is 40,000. I might be wrong. I think it says it in the notes in a minute. 40,000 shells rained down. Cannonballs and artillery shells rained down on Fort Sumter in 34 hours. So if you did the math, and I've never done the math, but if that's a constant bombardment, it's probably like boom, boom, boom. How much sleep do you think Robert Anderson's men are getting in that 34 hours? None. You can't sleep when you might blow up any minute now. How much food do you think they've had to eat while they're stuck in the middle of the harbor surrounded by Confederates? None. So they're hungry, they're scared. Here's the thing. Fort Sumter is built for war. It's supposed to have 135 cannon. It should be able to defend itself. It's supposed to have a garrison of 650 men. But because it wasn't ready to be used, Robert Anderson shows up with 85 men, and there's a total of 60 cannon. But these are huge cannon, and it takes 6 men to fire one of these cannon. He's only got 85 men, so how many cannon can he even possibly man? 85 divided by 6. But some of them are officers, and they're just going to stand around and watch. Maybe 10. That'd be take 60 men to man 10 cannons. So maybe 11 or 12, not very many. The Confederate soldier that attacks, his name is Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. Yeah, that's a long name. We're never going to say that again. In fact, I'll never make you answer a question, Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. His name, and he's kind of a big deal, his name from here on out is P.T. Beauregard. Nobody called him Pierre Gustave. Some say PGT, but nobody said Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard. Now that's just weird. By the way, anybody want to guess what Union officer trained Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard to fire artillery pieces at the military academy? Robert Anderson, the guy that he's trying to get out of Fort Sumter. So if you're firing artillery shells on the guy that trained you to fire artillery shells, are you trying to destroy him and kill him? What do you think your relationship is with the guy that taught you everything you know about the occupation that you love? It's probably good. Do you think P.T. Beauregard had a certain amount of respect for Robert Anderson? He doesn't want to kill him. It's his mentor, for crying out loud. So he has no intention of killing the guy. After 40,000 shells rained down on Fort Sumter, there are 0 people killed. What's that tell you about the fort?
It's good.
It's really good. But after 34 hours of nonstop bombardment and realizing that he's kind of toast and realizing that the Union can't save him, Robert Anderson raises a white flag. He meets with P.T. Beauregard. Beauregard comes out and he says, okay, what do you want to talk about? Now, when we talk about surrender after a battle or surrender after a war, the winning side gets to dictate the terms of surrender. So if P.T. Beauregard tells Robert Anderson, you can surrender and we'll let you go, but I'm going to bend over and you're going to kiss my rear end. Robert Anderson can say, no, we're not doing that. And then the battle will ensue. It will rage on. But since Beauregard didn't hate Robert Anderson, and since many of the Confederates that are fighting against the Union were on the same side only weeks earlier or months earlier, there's a certain amount of respect for each other, especially early on in the war. Beauregard says to Anderson, what can I do for you, sir? He respects him. And Anderson says, first of all, I appreciate that you're going to talk to me. My men are starving. Beauregard orders the Confederate Army to feed those Union soldiers. Anderson says, would you allow us passage back to the north? Meaning, will you let us go or are you taking us prisoners? Beauregard says, I got no reason to take you prisoners. I'll let your men have passage. We'll take your weapons, but go home. I'll put you on a boat myself and send you back north. So that's pretty friendly. Beauregard says, anything else I can do for you, sir? So they're maybe even trying to avoid a war at this point, or maybe the Confederates are trying to be kind enough to avoid a war. It's either that or P.T. Beauregard just has that much respect for Robert Anderson. And Anderson says, well, how about this? Let me fire 100 gun salute cannon for the American flag. He just wants to fire his cannons 100 times in respect for the American flag. Beauregard's like, well, I guess if you're not firing your cannon at us, go for it. Why does Robert Anderson want to fire 100 cannonballs into the ocean?
So they can waste their supply.
What? Say louder?
So you can waste their supply.
Because he knows that everything that he gives up inside that fort now is going to be Confederate. So if he can waste their supply, shoot cannonballs into the ocean, that's 100 fewer cannonballs that the Confederates can use later against him. Beauregard probably knows this, but he's like, yeah, whatever. Unfortunately, after about, I think it's like 43 shells they fired off, a cannon prematurely explodes, so it goes off before it's supposed to. The cannon blows up. In the notes, it says one man died. My sources say 2. I won't test you over that because I'm giving you 2 different answers here. So the first man that dies in the Civil War, before the war is even really a war, is a private named Daniel Hogue, and the second is another private named Edward Galloway. 4 men are hospitalized. So if Robert Anderson would not have asked to fire these cannon, would anyone have died? No. The first death, Robert Hogue, or Daniel Hogue, 43 guns, 40,000 shells. There were 80 Union, 85 Union soldiers, and about 500 Confederates involved in this battle. Not even so much a battle. It was pretty one-sided. The Union did fire back at the Confederacy. In fact, this is an interesting story. The Union soldier that was second in command at Fort Sumter, that gave the command to fire cannons back at the Confederates in a small fort called Fort Johnston or Fort Johnson. His name was Abner Doubleday. Now, for about 100 years, maybe not quite 100 years, Doubleday was inaccurately given credit for inventing something really important in America. Abner Doubleday was credited for a long time with inventing the game of baseball. He didn't. We believe baseball originated in about 1837, and the rules were way different then. But it is for sure that before the war broke out and the Union troops were stationed at Fort Moultrie, that Abner Doubleday and probably even Colonel Anderson would have been playing baseball with their men. So it was America's pastime even during the Civil War.
There's this cool history movie about how baseball was created. It's called The Ridiculous Six, and it was called Sticky McStickins, and before it was called baseball. It was really cool.
For real, that was Sticky McStickins? Is that a real thing?
Watch Ridiculous Six, and then you realize.
But is it true?
Yeah. Well, the movie says.
The movie says it's true. I don't know that. Here's a map of Fort Sumter, and here's Charleston. Charleston Harbor is critically important because if you look at the coastline of the South, there aren't a lot of good harbors. So if they're going to sell cotton and tobacco to finance a potential war with the Union, they're going to have good harbors, and Charleston is really one of the best. This is the same thing. It's a closer up view. But here when we look at it, here, by the way, here you see January 9th in 1861, the supply ship Star of the West. They're like, do, and they get here, and they're like, no, thank you, because they open fire. Here's Fort Moultrie. This is where Robert Anderson was originally stationed when he decides to move to Fort Sumter. If you visit Charleston, you get on a boat somewhere up here in the Cooper River, and you float past Castle Pinckney. This little island here is maybe the size of this classroom, a little bit bigger, not very much. So there's not really a castle on it. There's actually, as far as I know, nothing military about Castle Pinckney. I might be wrong. But look at all the red dots or red squares. When it says Moffett Channel Battery, a battery is a fancy name for a boatload of cannons. So Moffett Channel, boatload of cannons. Mortar battery number 2, Fort. Mortar battery number 1, enfilade battery, point battery, floating battery, mortar battery. Fort Johnson, this is the first shots were fired from Fort Johnson towards Fort Sumter. The West Mortar Battery, the East Mortar Battery, the Cummins Point Battery. I'll show you a picture in a minute, and you can see where all of these cannon, the Channel Batteries, the Citadel Battery. You know that any ship that's trying to get into Charleston is going to be destroyed. All of these batteries have a range that's capable of hitting Fort Sumter. So that's why 40,000 shells could rain down on this fortress. This is impenetrable. It would take the Union Army to get into Charleston and save the men at Fort Sumter. This is kind of a mess. This is what some people think it must have looked like. This is a model of what Fort Sumter was supposed to be when it was completed, though it was never fully completed. It's supposed to be 3 stories tall with cannon all over. This is what Fort Sumter looks like after some of the devastation. These are carriages for cannons, so they're just blown to smithereens. This is a guy sitting on a cannon that has exploded and knocked it completely out of the fort. So this is afterward. Now you guys tell me, what's the deal with this fence up here that looks like toothpicks, sharpened stakes? Yeah, Harry says, so people can't come up the hill. So if you're going to attack Fort Sumter and capture the fort, you might have to land a ship, send men scrambling up this hill, which we could probably climb up the hill, but it would slow us down. And we picture in our minds, or at least I do, men just running headlong into this and spearing them. Yeah, they're probably not that dumb, but it's going to slow them down. Today we wouldn't use a picket fence like this. We would use barbed wire or razor wire to slow down any kind of enemy. So it'd slice them up a little bit. So that's the purpose of that. This is what Fort Sumter looks like today. So if you visit Charleston, you can go there and you can see it's really kind of a shell of what it was intended to be. And you can also see this back here. This was covered with cannon. this out here's the ocean. So this, following my cursor, goes into Charleston Harbor. You maybe at low tide could access Fort Sumter by land, but this is like a muddy marsh. You probably sink up to your knees in mud. And I've stood right here before. This is covered with oyster shells and barnacles. It's just cut you up. So probably not going to get there very easily by land. The big black thing in here was not there at the time of the Civil War. It was added, I believe, sometime shortly after World War I. And I think the history of Fort Sumter would say that it was used all the way up through World War II, and they used it as a radar station to scan the skies for incoming aircraft that might be invading the United States. So Fort Sumter's got an interesting history, a long history. Today it's a museum. So you can take a boat. They drop you off right here. They say, we'll pick you up in an hour and a half, and the boat actually doesn't leave. So you go snoop around. You can walk around this little tiny island. You can go inside. There's bathrooms right here if you have to pee, right by the cursor. I don't remember if you can go inside the black thing, but you can snoop around the fort. It looks like this on the inside. So when we talk about how safe it was as a fort, look at the thickness of the wall. It's about 3 feet thick. So when a mortar shell or a cannonball strikes the walls of Fort Sumter, and it bounces. I mean, it's going to do some damage, but this is really, really thick. The size of this cannon, if I were standing next to it, it's about my height, to kind of put it into perspective. So to fire it, you roll it back. Actually, when it fires, the percussion of the fire rolls the cannon backwards. Then you can swab out the barrel with a gigantic Q-tip, like a man-sized Q-tip. Then you fill it with powder, fill it with a cannonball, and you put a fuse up here on the top. You pull a cord. Once you're ready to fire it, you roll it back forward. You can change the angle or the altitude that you're going to fire your projectile, rolling this little wheel, and you could change the direction by rolling it side to side on this track. So it's really pretty high tech. When you're ready to fire, you pull the cord, it snaps off the primer, it shoots a spark into the powder ignites, shooting the cannonball. So pretty high tech, yet really low tech compared to what we're used to. We're not going to watch this video, but I think it exists on your slideshow if you want to watch it on your own. It's like a national park guy talking about how these cannons would fire. There's no link to it. You can probably Google it, firing a cannon on YouTube at Fort Sumter, and it probably come up with something very similar, but it's not super interesting. So here's what we end up with, and this is where we will end today, so follow with me on this. Abraham Lincoln, after Fort Sumter, realizes his army isn't big enough, so he calls up 75,000 troops for a 90-day enlistment. 90 days, 3 months. What does that tell us Abraham Lincoln thought about the length of this war, or potential war? It's going to be short. If you join the army today, how much time do you think they'll spend training you before they even send you to fight? Probably a couple of months. If you have a specialty, maybe even longer than that. Basic training is going to be weeks and weeks and weeks. So they thought it was going to be short. Both sides thought it was going to be short. Look at this. Just to exemplify how short they thought it would be, an editor of a Charleston newspaper, so a South Carolina newspaper, said he would eat the bodies of all that might die. So was he either a really hungry cannibal, or did he think nobody was going to die? Yeah, he's not a cannibal. Or this former U.S. Senator, James Ch, I'll drink any blood spilled. After all, a lady's thimble will hold it all. Do you really like drinking blood? Is he a vampire? No. These guys are really, really, really wrong in their idea of how long and how bloody this war is going to be. So I'm going to guess after the first battle that we'll take a look at next time we have class, James Chestnut and this Charleston newspaper editor are probably like, never mind, I was just teasing. So the first battle, we're not going to even count it as the first battle because nobody's really killed as a result of fighting. And it's really not a contested battle. There's no way the Union has a chance to win. Fort Sumter really gets it kicked off. Now Lincoln's got tougher decisions to make, and so does Jefferson Davis for the Confederacy. It's looking more like war will exist but there's still questions as to how big it will be. 75,000 men isn't a lot, and 90 days certainly isn't a lot.